A veteran Navy SEAL thought he had seen everything, until his dog refused to take another step in the forest. There was no sound, no warning, just silence so deep it felt wrong. Then, beyond the trees, they found a massive ship that should never have been there. But it wasn't abandoned. Something inside was still alive, and the deeper they went, the more his dog began to recognize something. Not fear, but memory. What they uncovered would force him to face a mistake he thought was buried forever. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from, and don't forget to like and subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories. The morning looked too clean to be trusted. Sunlight spilled through the tall northern pines in pale gold shafts, touching the forest floor with the kind of tenderness that made old wounds feel almost embarrassed for still existing. The air smelled of sap, cold sand, and the faint mineral breath of stone warming under the day. Somewhere high above, a jay shrieked once and then seemed to think better of it. After that, the woods settled into a hush so complete it felt arranged. Cade Mercer noticed things like that. At 43, the former Navy SEAL had the kind of face that looked as if it had been carved with a dull knife and then left in bad weather. He stood around 6'1", broad-shouldered, lean and hard through the chest and arms, carrying the compact strength of a man who had spent years treating exhaustion like an inconvenience. His jaw was sharp, his beard reduced to a permanent shadow of rough stubble, and his deep blue-gray eyes never truly rested. Even in stillness, they were measuring distance, exits, angles, mistakes. His dark brown hair was cut short in an old military habit, practical and neat, though silver had already begun to show at the temples like frost refusing to wait its turn. He wore the same thing he always wore, an olive field jacket faded by weather, a red and dark blue plaid shirt beneath it, dark cargo pants, and worn brown leather boots that had crossed more ground than some people saw in a lifetime. An old military watch sat on his wrist. A folding knife rode in his pocket. His Eberle stock half-track backpack leaned against a stump nearby, packed with the sort of careful efficiency that was less a preference now than a religion. He had learned long ago that disorder got people killed. Riven, on the other hand, had learned that silence saved them first. The German shepherd stood a few yards away, black and tan coat bright where the sun found it, dark where the shadows held it. Around 5 or 6 years old, Riven had the balanced, compact muscularity of a true working dog. Nothing showy, nothing wasted. His chest was deep, his legs clean and quick, his posture steady as a drawn line. The black tactical harness on his body carried a simple patch: K9 Riven. His ears were high and alert. His eyes, dark and sharply intelligent, moved over the trees with relentless concentration. Riven rarely barked without reason. He was not one of those dogs who filled emptiness with noise. He watched. He listened. Then, when he acted, Cade had learned to pay attention. They had been moving for weeks again. No plan worth naming, no town long enough to matter, just roads thinning into trails, trails dissolving into forest, and forest giving them what the rest of the world no longer could. Space enough for memory to quiet down, if only for an hour at a time. Cade crouched near a patch of sandy soil and pressed 2 fingers into it. Dry on top, cooler beneath. Nearby, half swallowed by scrub grass and pine needles, ran the faint scar of an old road, once graded, long abandoned, now breaking apart under roots and weather. He studied it with that unreadable patience of his. "There used to be something here," he said softly. Riven glanced at him, then back toward the deeper woods, unimpressed by human discoveries that took longer than they should. Cade let out the ghost of a smile. His humor, when it surfaced at all, came dry enough to crack. Right. You knew that already. He had chosen the small clearing because it was defensible and because old roads often meant water, shelter, or at least the bones of forgotten infrastructure. But now that he stood inside it, he felt the wrongness of the place begin to gather around the edges. Not danger exactly. Not yet. More like the lingering shape of absence. As if people had once passed through here with urgency and then never come back to explain themselves. He reached for his canteen, took a drink, and turned at the sound of nothing. That was what caught him. Not a branch breaking, not brush shifting, not a voice, just the absence of the usual layered sounds of a living forest. No squirrel chatter, no wing beat close by, no small life moving in the understory. The quiet had become too complete, too polished. Then he saw Riven. The dog had gone utterly still. One forepaw lifted slightly off the ground, ears forward, head tilted not upward, not downward, but toward a precise point somewhere beyond the visible trees. He was not tense in the way he became before a strike. He was alert in a different way, drawn inward, almost listening through the earth itself. Riven. No response. Cade straightened slowly. Years ago, in places with names he no longer liked remembering, he had seen men make the mistake of treating a trained dog's instincts like background noise. Some of those men had not lived long enough to correct the habit. Cade had survived partly because he respected what could not be explained in time. He stepped toward the dog, careful not to crowd him. What is it? Riven did not bark. He did not growl. He only stared into the trees, every line of his body saying the same thing with terrifying certainty. There. A familiar sensation slid coldly down Cade's spine. It came from somewhere older than thought. The battlefield had taught him to distinguish curiosity from warning, tension from instinct, fear from truth. This was truth. Whatever waited out there had reached Riven before it had reached him. Cade picked up his pack, slung it over one shoulder, and scanned the woods ahead. Sunlight flashed through the pines in bright strips, beautiful and useless. "All right," he murmured. "You lead." Riven moved at once, not fast, not recklessly. He advanced with that fluid, measured precision that always made Cade think of a sentence being written by something wiser than language. They left the old clearing behind and entered thicker forest, where the air turned cooler and carried the damp smell of moss and old bark. Cade followed in silence, boots sinking lightly into pine duff and pale sandy patches. Overhead, branches wove together and broke apart again. Every so often, he caught glimpses of brighter light ahead, then lost it. As they walked, old thoughts rose up in the spaces between footfalls, because silence had a bad habit of inviting ghosts. There had been another dog once. Cade never spoke of that part to anyone, because there was no one to tell, and because words made some failures too real. The memory lived in pieces. Rotor wash, smoke, one shouted order too late, and a shape that had trusted him without hesitation. He had obeyed. Someone else had not made it out. Since then, he had stopped believing that duty and righteousness were cousins. Sometimes they were strangers who happened to wear the same uniform. Riven stopped again. Cade nearly walked into him. The dog's head lowered. His nostrils flared. Then, unexpectedly, he stepped sideways, not forward, and placed his body across Cade's path. Cade froze. It was such a small thing, and yet it landed inside him like a stone dropped down a well. Riven only blocked him like that when he recognized danger with a kind of personal certainty. For a moment, nothing happened. Sunlight moved gently between the trees. A breeze touched the upper branches and failed to reach the ground. Cade frowned, then looked down. Half hidden beneath needles and scrub was a narrow depression in the earth, long and straight. Not natural. A collapsed drainage trench, maybe, or the edge of something man had buried over time. One more step, and he might have twisted an ankle badly enough to make the entire day stupid. Cade exhaled through his nose and rested a hand briefly on the dog's neck. "You just enjoy proving a point." Riven's ears twitched as if accepting the compliment on behalf of all superior life forms. That was the moment the unease deepened. Because the warning had not felt like it belonged to a ditch. It had felt bigger, stranger, older. And when Riven moved again, he did so with more urgency than before. About 20 minutes later, they reached a ridge where the pines thinned and the light opened wide. Riven stopped so abruptly that sand skidded beneath his paws. Then he made a sound Cade had heard only a handful of times. A low, restrained whine. Not of fear, but of recognition, so impossible it bordered on grief. Cade stepped up beside him and looked down. At first his mind refused to make sense of what his eyes were seeing. Scale shattered logic. The shape below was too massive, too wrong for the land that held it. Sunlight struck white metal streaked with rust. Rows of broken windows stared out like emptied sockets. Decks sagged under weeds and brush, vines crawled over railings. Sand had risen around the lower hull as if the earth had been trying, unsuccessfully, to swallow it for years. A cruise ship. A goddamn cruise ship, enormous and half-collapsed, stranded beyond the tree line in a vast spread of pale sand and scrub, with the northern forest standing beside it like a witness that had long ago stopped answering questions. For one absurd second, Cade thought he might still be asleep. Then Riven stepped in front of him again. Not toward the ship, against it. Cade said nothing for several moments because there are discoveries so large that language arrives late and underdressed. He only stood there on the ridge, tall and motionless, his face unreadable except for the tightening around the eyes. The ship below looked less like a vessel than a carcass too enormous for nature to digest. Multi-decked, sprawling, and tilted slightly into the sand, it dominated the clearing with a ruined grandeur that felt almost theatrical. Furniture and twisted debris lay scattered around its base. Grass and scrub had rooted themselves in exposed seams. Parts of the upper structure had caved in. Yet even from this distance, the thing remained monstrous in scale, broad and towering enough to dwarf the surrounding terrain. "How?" Cade said at last, quiet enough that the forest might keep the question for itself. "Does something like you end up here?" Riven offered no theory. Cade adjusted the strap of his pack and studied the ground below, the tree line, the angles of exposure. Years of training took over where astonishment ended. Open sand meant little cover. The ship offered too many blind spots, too many entry points, too many places for something or someone to be waiting. And still, beneath all that caution, another feeling moved. Not wonder. Not exactly. Recognition. As if he had not found the ship by accident at all, but had simply arrived at the place some buried part of his life had been circling for years. He hated thoughts like that. They smelled too much like fate, and fate had always been a lazy excuse for what people chose to do. Still, he could not deny the pressure building in his chest. Riven remained planted in front of him, body firm, gaze fixed on the wreck. The dog's instincts had brought them here. Now those same instincts refused the next step. Cade looked down at him. "You brought me to it," he said, "and now you don't want me near it." Riven's eyes flicked toward him just once, dark and steady, before returning to the ship. That answer, in its own way, was answer enough. The sun climbed higher. Warm light ran over the ruined decks, over the burst windows and rusted rails, making the impossible thing below them look even more real. Behind Cade, the forest stood quiet and watchful. Ahead, the ship waited in bright silence, like some giant dead secret the land had failed to bury. Cade felt the old combat instinct settle fully into place. Not panic, not excitement, but clarity sharpened by risk. Whatever this place was, whatever story had left such a beast stranded between sand and trees, it was not finished with the world yet. He took one careful step forward. Riven moved instantly, crossing in front of him and stopping dead, broad chest blocking his path. Not a request, a warning. And with the bright wreck gleaming below them like a lie too big to tell quietly, Cade Mercer finally understood one thing with perfect certainty. The dog was not afraid of what they had found. He was afraid of what was still alive inside it. Cade didn't move for a long time. The ridge beneath his boots felt steady, grounded, real. Everything below it did not. The ship dominated the clearing like a forgotten monument to something no one had bothered to explain. From this distance, Cade could begin to understand its structure more clearly. Multiple decks stacked in a tiered slope, the upper levels partially collapsed. The lower hull buried deep in pale sand and scrub. Rust streaked down its sides like old wounds left open too long. Windows were shattered or missing entirely, leaving black hollows that reflected nothing back. But what unsettled him wasn't the damage. It was the scale. Even stripped of purpose, the ship still commanded the land around it. It didn't belong to the forest. It didn't belong to the sand. It simply existed there, like something dropped from the wrong world. Cade adjusted his stance and scanned the perimeter again. No movement, no voices, no visible tracks from where he stood. And yet, Riven hadn't relaxed. The dog remained in front of him, body firm, weight slightly forward, as if bracing against something unseen. His ears flicked once, twice, tracking something Cade still couldn't hear. "Yeah," Cade murmured under his breath. "I feel it too." He didn't. Not yet. But he trusted that he would. After a moment, Cade stepped to the side instead of forward, testing the dog's reaction. Riven allowed it, but only within a narrow margin, adjusting his own position to stay between Cade and the slope leading down toward the wreck. That was enough. Cade exhaled slowly, then shifted direction, moving along the ridgeline instead of descending directly. If there was something wrong down there, he would approach it on his own terms. The terrain changed as he moved. Pine roots gave way to patches of loose sand, then back to firmer ground where grasses had taken hold. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the dry scent of sun-warmed metal and something else, faint, almost lost beneath the natural smells. Oil, old, thin, but not entirely dead. Cade stopped. His gaze narrowed slightly. That shouldn't be there. Not after decades. He continued forward, more alert now, letting his eyes sweep the ground ahead of every step. It didn't take long before he saw it. Something subtle enough that most people would have walked right past it. A clean edge. Not nature-made, not time-worn. A section of exposed metal near the base of the slope had been cut recently. The rust around it was uneven, the surface beneath still brighter, less weathered. The angle of the cut was precise, deliberate. Cade crouched, brushing a hand lightly over the edge without touching it directly. "Not abandoned," he said quietly. Behind him, Riven gave the faintest shift of weight. Agreement. Cade leaned back on his heels, eyes moving again across the wreck. 25 years. That was the number that surfaced in his memory, pulled from something he'd read once in a roadside diner or overheard in passing conversation. A flood. Massive. Unusual. The kind that reshaped land instead of simply drowning it. A ship lost inland, dragged or pushed beyond where it had any right to be. Then, later, a salvage operation that never finished. Funding cut. Interest gone. Too difficult. Too expensive. So they had left it, and the forest had done the rest. Except now, someone had come back. Cade stood. "Let's take a closer look," he said. Riven didn't move. For a moment, the dog remained exactly where he was, gaze locked forward, body refusing the command, not out of disobedience, but out of certainty. Then, slowly, reluctantly, he stepped aside. Not because the danger had lessened, but because Cade had chosen. They descended together. The sand near the base of the slope shifted under Cade's boots, soft and unstable, forcing him to adjust his balance with each step. Up close, the ship became even more overwhelming. The hull towered above them, metal plates warped and torn in places, thick vines crawling across its surface like veins, reclaiming flesh. Broken staircases led upward at odd angles. Railings hung loose or had collapsed entirely. Debris lay scattered around the base. Old furniture, rusted containers, fragments of things that had once belonged somewhere else. A mattress lay half buried in sand. A cracked wooden dresser leaned against a bent section of railing. All of it looked as though it had been thrown outward and then forgotten. Cade moved carefully through it, stepping over and around obstacles without disturbing them more than necessary. Still no voices, still no visible movement. But the silence here felt different from the forest. Heavier. Contained. As if the air itself was holding something back. Riven stayed close now, no longer ahead but slightly behind and to Cade's side. A protective position. His head moved constantly, scanning, scenting, reading layers of information Cade could not access. They reached the first accessible opening in the hull, a jagged gap where a section of metal had been cut away. Not torn, cut. Cade paused just outside it. The interior beyond was dim, shadows stretching deep into the ship's skeletal corridors. Light filtered in through broken windows and gaps above, but it wasn't enough to fully illuminate the space. "Same rules," Cade said quietly. "You feel something? We stop." Riven's tail gave a single, controlled flick. They entered. The temperature dropped immediately. Inside, the air was cooler, stale, carrying the layered scent of rust, dust, and long-decayed fabric. The corridor ahead sloped slightly, warped by years of shifting weight. Pieces of ceiling hung low. The floor was uneven, littered with fragments of glass and debris. Cade's boots made almost no sound as he moved. The hallway stretched forward, branching left and right at intervals. Doors stood ajar or hung off their hinges. Inside some rooms, faded furniture remained. Beds stripped bare, cabinets open, personal belongings scattered as if abandoned mid-movement. There was something unsettling about that. Not chaos, not panic, just interruption. As though whatever had happened here had been quiet enough that no one had time to react properly. Cade paused at one doorway and glanced inside. A child's room, small bunk. A toy still resting on the floor, plastic, sun-bleached, forgotten. Dust had settled thick over everything, but the arrangement remained almost intact. He stepped back out without comment. Behind him, Riven let out a low breath. Not fear. Awareness. They continued deeper. About a third of the way into the ship's interior, Riven stopped again, this time so suddenly that Cade felt the shift before he fully registered it. The dog's head lowered. His body stiffened, not outwardly aggressive, not defensive, but intensely focused. Then, slowly, Riven turned his head, not toward the corridor ahead, but toward the wall. Cade frowned. "What is it?" Riven stepped closer to the metal surface, nose hovering inches away. He didn't touch it. He didn't scratch. He just stood there, listening, scenting, as if something existed on the other side that had reached out to him first. Then, without warning, he sat down. Not relaxed, not calm, waiting. Cade's pulse slowed. That was new. Riven didn't sit in the face of danger. He positioned himself. Cade stepped closer to the wall, eyes narrowing. At first he saw nothing, just rusted metal, seams, and old paint flaking away. Then he noticed it. A faint line. Too straight to be random. Too clean to be age. A hidden panel. Before Cade could react further, something deep within the ship shifted. A sound. Faint. Almost too quiet to exist. A low, rhythmic hum. Not wind. Not settling metal. Something mechanical. Alive. Cade didn't move for several seconds. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, leaving only the echo of its presence behind. But it had been real. He glanced down at Riven. The dog was already looking at him. No confusion, no hesitation, just that same unshakable certainty. Cade exhaled slowly. "Yeah," he said under his breath. "I hear it." And now he did. Not clearly, not continuously, but enough. Enough to know that whatever this place had been, it wasn't finished yet. They moved again, slower this time, following the subtle architecture of the ship inward. Cade began to notice the differences more clearly now. Most of the interior remained untouched, dust-covered, decayed, left to time. But some sections were not. A corridor ahead showed less debris. The floor had been cleared, recently enough that the difference was visible even in low light. A section of wiring ran along the wall, newer than everything around it. Improvised. Temporary. Intentional. Cade crouched again, studying the floor. No obvious footprints, but the absence of dust in certain patches told its own story. People had been here. Recently. Riven shifted beside him, then angled his body slightly toward the darker section ahead. Cade followed his gaze. The air there felt different, not just cooler, structured, contained, as if the deeper parts of the ship were holding something together that the rest had already surrendered. Cade stood. Every instinct he had sharpened over years of survival settled into place. Not adrenaline, not fear. Focus. He adjusted his grip on the strap of his pack, then gave a small nod. "Careful," he said. Riven stepped forward first. This time, Cade didn't question it. They moved toward the deeper section of the ship, toward the part that refused to die quietly. And just before the darkness swallowed the last of the natural light behind them, Cade heard it again. That same faint mechanical rhythm. Steady, hidden, breathing in a place that should have been long dead. The deeper they went, the more the ship began to feel. Arranged. Not restored, not repaired, but managed. Cade moved slowly through the corridor, his shoulders slightly angled, minimizing his profile as he advanced. The air had changed again. Less stale now, carrying a faint trace of heat and something chemical beneath it, not enough to choke. Just enough to remind him this place wasn't entirely abandoned. Riven stayed close, no longer drifting ahead, his movements tighter, more deliberate. His head shifted in small, precise arcs, tracking things Cade could not see. Every few steps, his ears would twitch, locking onto some distant disturbance, then resetting again. Cade paused at a corner and leaned just enough to glance ahead. Light, faint, artificial, leaking from a partially open passage further down. He pulled back immediately, heart rate steady but focused. Then he crouched low and studied the floor. Dust patterns. Disturbed. Not chaotic, not rushed, repeated, foot traffic, recent. Cade's jaw tightened slightly. "Still here," he whispered. Riven didn't look at him. He didn't need to. Cade shifted his weight, then moved forward again, slower now, keeping to the darker edges of the corridor where shadow swallowed detail. As he approached the light source, the structure of the ship changed subtly. The decay gave way. Not entirely, but enough to notice. A cable ran along the wall. New, black insulation, intact. It had been clipped into place with metal brackets that hadn't rusted yet. The line disappeared into the room ahead. Cade crouched beside it, studying the connection point. Temporary setup. Portable power. Not permanent infrastructure, something designed to be installed, used, and removed if necessary. He followed the cable with his eyes, then froze. Voices. Muted. Close. Cade lowered himself further, flattening against the wall just before the opening. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see into the space beyond. 3 men, all wearing protective suits, lightweight, not military grade, but functional. White, slightly stained, with respirator masks hanging loose around their necks rather than fully secured. That alone told Cade something important. They weren't expecting immediate danger. One of them stood slightly apart from the others. He was tall, around 6'2", with a lean, angular frame that suggested endurance over brute strength. His face was narrow, cheekbones pronounced, with a trimmed beard that looked maintained even in a place like this. Dark hair, pulled back roughly, a few strands escaping and falling forward. His eyes, sharp, calculating, moved constantly, never resting long on one thing. This man wasn't just present, he was in control. The other 2 were quieter, broader in build, less attentive to detail. Workers, not leaders. Cade leaned in just enough to catch fragments of their conversation. "Timing's off," one of the broader men muttered. "Then adjust the window," the tall man replied, voice calm, clipped. "We don't miss another transfer. Samples won't hold that long." "They'll hold long enough," the tall man said, without raising his voice. "They always do." Cade's eyes narrowed. Samples, transfer window. His gaze flicked toward the equipment inside the room. Tables, crates, sealed containers, metallic, reinforced. And something else. Movement, subtle, contained. Riven shifted beside him, barely perceptible. Cade placed a hand lightly against the dog's shoulder. Not yet. The men continued talking, their voices low, but controlled. "Next shipment?" one asked. 2 days, the tall man replied. "If everything stays quiet." Cade's mind worked quickly. 2 days meant schedule. Schedule meant pattern. Pattern meant opportunity. He pulled back slowly, careful not to disturb anything, then retreated down the corridor with Riven in silent synchronization. They didn't stop until the voices were gone entirely. Only then did Cade allow himself a breath. "Not scavengers," he murmured. "Not squatters." Riven's gaze remained fixed ahead. Cade glanced at him. "You knew that already." Riven didn't confirm it. He simply turned and began moving in a different direction. The path Riven chose wasn't obvious. It cut away from the cleaner sections, deeper into the older parts of the ship, areas where the decay still ruled, where the structure creaked faintly under its own weight and the light faded into thin, broken lines. Cade followed without question. The dog wasn't tracking the men. He was tracking something else, something older, something deeper. The corridor narrowed as they moved, the ceiling dipping lower, forcing Cade to adjust his posture slightly. The walls here were thicker, reinforced, less decorative, more functional. Engineering sections, maintenance zones, places passengers were never meant to see. Riven slowed, then stopped. His body stiffened, not in alarm, but in recognition. Cade stepped beside him, eyes scanning. Nothing obvious, just another corridor, another closed door, another stretch of rusted metal. Then Riven moved again, but this time not forward, sideways, toward a narrow passage partially blocked by collapsed debris. Cade studied it briefly, then crouched and began clearing a path, moving pieces quietly, deliberately, making space just wide enough to pass through. On the other side, the air changed again, warmer, denser, alive in a way the rest of the ship wasn't. Cade felt it immediately, and then he heard breathing, not human, not mechanical, something in between. Riven moved ahead without hesitation this time, not cautious, not uncertain, purposeful. He stopped in front of a heavy metal door, thicker than anything they'd passed so far. Reinforced. Industrial. Its surface was cleaner than the surrounding walls, as if it had been used frequently. Riven didn't scratch, didn't bark. He simply stood there and lowered his head. Then, slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against the cold metal. Cade's breath caught. He had seen Riven track enemies. He had seen him detect explosives. He had seen him freeze at the edge of unseen danger. But this was different. This was not warning. This was recognition. And from the other side of the door, something shifted. A faint movement. A soft, restrained sound. Not mechanical. Alive. Cade stepped closer. His pulse remained steady, but something deeper moved beneath it now. Something old. Something buried. Something he had spent years refusing to examine too closely. "Easy," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he meant the dog or himself. He ran his fingers along the edge of the door. Locked. Of course it was, but not permanently sealed. Used, maintained. He stepped back, eyes scanning the frame, the hinges, the locking mechanism. Standard industrial design, modified slightly. Reinforced, but not impossible. He could open it. Eventually. But that wasn't the point. Not yet. Riven stepped back from the door and turned to look at him. And in that look, there was no urgency, no fear, only expectation. Cade exhaled slowly. "Not alone," he said quietly. The realization settled into place with unsettling clarity. Whatever was being moved through this ship was alive. And whatever system had been built around it wasn't designed to protect it. It was designed to contain it. Cade straightened. His gaze moved back toward the direction they had come from. The cleaner corridors, the men, the equipment. Then back to the door. Then to Riven. "This isn't a base," he said, voice low, controlled. "It's a holding ground." Riven's ears shifted slightly. Agreement. Cade took one final look at the door, then stepped back. "Let's find out who built the cage." Riven didn't move immediately. For a brief second, he looked back at the metal surface. Then he turned and led the way deeper. The deeper levels of the ship felt less like a ruin, and more like something waiting to be understood. Cade followed Riven down a narrow maintenance stairwell, the metal steps groaning faintly under their weight. The structure here was different, reinforced, enclosed, designed to protect machinery rather than people. The air grew heavier as they descended, warmer, carrying a faint metallic tang mixed with something organic. Something alive. Not decay. Presence. Cade's movements became slower, more deliberate. Every step measured, every breath controlled. His hand hovered near the knife at his pocket, not drawn, but ready. Riven led without hesitation now. Whatever uncertainty had held him back before was gone. Now there was only direction. At the base of the stairwell, a long corridor stretched ahead, dimly lit by industrial lamps mounted along the walls. Unlike the upper decks, this area showed almost no signs of abandonment. The floor was clean, not polished, but maintained. Dust had been disturbed regularly. The walls, though aged, were intact. And along both sides of the corridor, containers, dozens of them, metallic, reinforced, uniform in size, each one sealed with heavy latches and marked with faded identification codes that had long since lost their original meaning. Cade stopped. His eyes moved slowly across the line of containers, his expression tightening, not in fear, but in recognition. Storage, he murmured. But not for cargo, not like this. He stepped closer to the nearest container, studying its surface. The metal was scratched, worn, not from time, but from contact. From something inside pressing outward, testing limits. He didn't open it. Not yet. Riven moved past him, further down. Purposeful. The dog's pace slowed as he approached the center of the corridor. His ears tilted back slightly, not in submission, but in focus. His breathing changed, deeper, quieter. Then he stopped. Cade followed. The container in front of them looked no different than the others at first glance. Same structure, same locking system, same worn metal exterior. But Riven's reaction made it something else entirely. The dog lowered his body slowly, not lying down, not relaxing, positioning. His chest came close to the ground, his head lowered until his nose hovered just inches from the container door. His ears flattened slightly, not in fear, but in a kind of quiet, contained intensity. He didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move. He just stayed there, listening. Cade felt something tighten in his chest. Riven. No response. The dog didn't even look at him. Cade stepped closer. His hand reached out, fingers brushing lightly over the metal surface. Cold, solid, silent, but not empty. He could feel it now, not through sound, not through sight, but through something older, more instinctive. The same way you could stand in a room and know you weren't alone without needing proof something was inside. And Riven knew exactly what it was. Riven shifted slightly, pressing closer, not against the container, but near it, as if aligning himself with something on the other side. Then he made a sound, soft, almost inaudible. Not a bark, not a warning, a low, restrained whine. But it wasn't fear. It was recognition. And from within the container, something moved, slow, weak, but unmistakably deliberate. Cade's breath caught, not because of the sound, but because of what Riven did next. The dog lowered himself fully this time, head down, still, waiting, as if greeting something he had never met. Cade's hand tightened slightly on the latch. His pulse remained steady, but something deeper was shifting now. Something he had spent years refusing to revisit. "I don't like this," he muttered. But his hand didn't move away. Carefully, he examined the locking mechanism. Heavy duty, but not impossible. Designed for containment, not for permanent sealing. He worked the latch slowly, minimizing sound. Each movement controlled, precise. The metal resisted slightly, then gave. One lock, then another. The final latch released with a soft, controlled click. Cade paused, listened. Nothing from the corridor behind them. No footsteps, no voices. Still alone. He pulled the door open just enough to see inside. At first, the darkness swallowed everything. Then his eyes adjusted, and the world shifted. Inside the container, curled tightly against the far wall, was a dog. A German Shepherd. Older, much older. Its body was thinner than it should have been, muscle reduced, but not gone. Its coat, once likely strong and full, now dulled with age and neglect. Patches of fur were thinner along the flanks. Scars marked its legs, old ones, healed poorly. But it wasn't the condition that stopped Cade's breath. It was the collar, military, faded, but still there. A metal tag hung from it, worn but intact. The dog lifted its head slowly, its eyes opened. Clouded slightly with age, but still aware, still focused, still present. Cade didn't move, couldn't. For a moment, the corridor, the ship, everything else disappeared. All that remained was that image. A confined space. A loyal animal. Left behind. Memory didn't return in a rush. It unfolded slowly, like something that had been waiting for permission. Rotor wash, sand and noise, a command shouted too late, a shape running toward him, and then not. Cade swallowed hard. His jaw tightened, but not from anger, from something worse. Recognition. "I know," he whispered. Not to Riven, not even to himself, to the past. Behind him, Riven moved, slowly, gently. He stepped into the container, lowering his head toward the older dog. No tension, no dominance, no fear, just presence. The older dog watched him. Then, after a moment, it shifted slightly closer. Cade felt something break open inside his chest. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. Enough to let something long buried breathe again. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle the animal. "It's okay," he said quietly. "You're not staying here." The dog didn't respond immediately, but it didn't retreat. That was enough. Cade reached forward, hand steady, movement slow. He didn't touch it yet, just let his presence settle, let the space adjust. Behind him, the ship remained silent. For a moment, a fragile one, a borrowed one. Then, a sharp tone cut through the corridor, high-pitched, electronic, unmistakable. Cade's head snapped up. Alarm. The sound echoed through the metal structure, bouncing off walls, growing louder with each second. Riven stepped back instantly, body shifting from calm to readiness in a single breath. The older dog flinched, ears flattening, body tensing. Cade stood. "Damn it!" He glanced down the corridor, mind already calculating. Time, distance, options. They had none. "They know," he said. Riven's posture confirmed it. Every muscle ready, every sense engaged. Cade looked back at the dog in the container, then at Riven, then at the open corridor beyond. A decision, not between right and wrong, but between now and later. He stepped back toward the container. "We're not done here," he said quietly. The alarm continued to blare. Closer now. Footsteps would follow. They always did. Cade moved quickly, securing the latch just enough to hold, but not enough to trap. Temporary, like everything else. Then he turned. Move. Riven didn't hesitate. Together, they disappeared back into the shadows of the ship, leaving behind something that was no longer just a mission, but a promise. The alarm didn't sound like panic. It sounded like precision. A sharp, repeating tone echoed through the metal corridors, controlled and consistent, as if the ship itself had awakened and was now following a script written long before Cade ever stepped inside. He moved fast, but not blindly. Years of training snapped back into place, not as memory, but as instinct. Cade didn't run. He flowed. Every step placed with intent, every turn calculated. His body lowered slightly as he moved, minimizing his profile, using the broken geometry of the ship as cover. Left, he whispered. Riven was already there. The German shepherd moved like a shadow given purpose, silent, efficient, his body weaving through debris and narrow gaps without hesitation. His ears flicked constantly, catching sounds before they fully formed. Twice, he shifted direction before Cade even heard the faint echo of approaching boots. That was how they stayed ahead. Not speed, awareness. A narrow corridor opened ahead, lined with broken doors and exposed wiring. Cade slowed just enough to glance upward. A small device mounted near the ceiling. Camera. He didn't stop moving. Instead, he shifted his angle slightly, keeping to the blind edge beneath its rotation arc. The movement was subtle, practiced, the kind of adjustment that looked accidental unless you knew what to look for. Riven mirrored it without command. Good, Cade murmured. They reached a junction. Voices, closer now. Cade raised a hand. Riven froze instantly. Two men stepped into view from the right corridor. Not the same ones as before. These were heavier, more heavily equipped. Dark clothing beneath their protective gear. One carried a compact firearm low at his side. The other scanned the corridor with nervous, quick movements. Not professionals. Not like Cade. But dangerous enough. Cade didn't hesitate. He moved forward in one clean motion. The first man barely had time to turn before Cade closed the distance, one hand striking the wrist, the other driving into the shoulder. The weapon dropped with a dull metallic clatter. Cade caught the man before he hit the ground, lowering him silently. The second man reacted, but too slowly. Riven was already there. The dog lunged low, controlled, his body hitting the man's legs with precision. Not a wild attack. A calculated disruption. The man lost balance, crashing into the wall. Cade stepped in. One movement, one strike. Silence again. Riven stepped back immediately, posture resetting, eyes already scanning for the next threat. Cade exhaled once. Still got it, he muttered. Riven didn't care. He turned his head slightly, listening, then moved. Again. They didn't retrace their path. Cade knew better than that. Instead, he followed Riven deeper into the ship, moving laterally, cutting across internal corridors rather than heading straight for any exit. It was slower, but safer. And then, they found them. The containers. Not just one corridor, multiple. Rows upon rows, extending further than Cade had expected. Some sealed. Some partially open. Some damaged. And inside, movement. Cade approached the nearest one, pulling the latch carefully. Inside, a small animal, something fox-like, blinked weakly in the dim light. Its fur was patchy, its body thin, but it was alive. Barely. Cade's jaw tightened. Jesus. Riven stood beside him, still, watching. Not reacting with aggression, not reacting with fear, just witnessing. Cade moved quickly now, container after container, unlocking, opening, releasing. Some animals stumbled out immediately, disoriented, blinking against the light. Others hesitated, too weak to move, their bodies conditioned to confinement. Cade didn't rush them. He simply opened the way. "Go," he said quietly, though he knew they didn't understand the word. They understood the space, the absence of walls. That was enough. Riven moved among them carefully, adjusting his position, guiding without touching, ensuring none panicked or turned aggressive. His presence alone created order where chaos might have erupted. For a moment, it worked. Light filtered down from a broken section of the upper deck. Dust drifted through the beams, catching in the air like something almost peaceful. The animals moved slowly toward it, drawn by instinct, by warmth, by something that felt like escape. Cade stood in the middle of it, chest rising slowly. This was right. For the first time since entering the ship, something felt aligned, balanced, as if the world had shifted just slightly back toward where it was supposed to be. Riven stopped moving, not abruptly, not in alarm, but with a stillness that carried weight. Cade turned. The dog stood near the center of the corridor, head tilted slightly, not toward the animals, not toward Cade, but upward, listening, not to the alarm, to something else. A second later, the light above them flickered, once, twice, then shifted, not off, not broken, controlled, and the air changed, subtle but immediate. A low vibration passed through the floor, so faint most people wouldn't notice it. Cade did, because he had felt something like it before, not in ships, not in forests, in places designed to trap. The first door slammed shut, metal against metal, loud, final. Cade turned instantly. "What?" Another door, then another, each one sealing off a section of the ship with mechanical precision. Not random, sequential. Riven moved immediately, stepping closer to Cade, body low, ready. "They're locking it down," Cade said. The realization hit hard and fast. This wasn't a reaction. It was a system, designed to respond exactly like this. Cade grabbed one of the doors as it began to slide shut, bracing against it with everything he had. For a second, it held. Then the mechanism overpowered him. The door slammed closed with a force that rattled the entire corridor. Cade stepped back. Damn it! Around them, the space had changed. The open pathways were gone, the exits sealed. They weren't escaping. They were being contained. Riven's ears snapped forward. Footsteps, approaching, deliberate, not rushed. Whoever was coming wasn't worried. Cade turned toward the sound. Then he saw him. Marcus Hale stepped into view like he had been expected all along. He moved with the calm confidence of someone who had never once doubted his control over the situation. Tall, just over 6 feet, with a lean, composed frame that spoke of discipline rather than brute strength. His face was sharp, almost sculpted, with a clean jawline and faint lines at the corners of his eyes. Not from age, but from restraint. His dark hair was neatly kept, touched with early strands of gray at the temples. His clothing was precise. A charcoal coat, fitted and clean despite the environment, layered over a dark, high-collar shirt. Everything about him suggested order, control. His eyes settled on Cade. Not surprised, not impressed, evaluating. "You're further in than most," Marcus said, his voice smooth, measured. That usually means two things. He glanced briefly at the open containers. Curiosity, then at Riven, and attachment. Cade didn't respond. Marcus took a few steps closer, not threatening, not cautious, certain. You think you're saving them? He asked, almost conversationally. Then, with the faintest shift in tone, you're just slowing the inevitable. The words didn't echo. They settled, heavy, deliberate. Cade held his gaze. Maybe, he said. But I'm still going to try. For a moment, something flickered in Marcus's expression. Not anger, not amusement, recognition. Then it was gone. Marcus stepped back slightly. Good, he said, almost approving. Then, he gestured once. Behind him, movement, more men, more control, the trap complete. Cade felt it then. Not fear, not doubt, clarity. This wasn't an escape anymore. This was engagement. A system, a structure, a hunt. He shifted his stance slightly, adjusting his weight. Riven mirrored him, side by side, not cornered, not yet. Cade's voice dropped barely above a breath. Then, let's see how inevitable it really is. The air no longer felt like air. It felt processed, filtered, controlled. Cade stood still for half a second longer than necessary. Not because he was hesitating, but because he was listening. Not to the men, not to the alarm that had already faded into a lower, more stable tone. To the structure itself. The ship wasn't panicking. It was adapting. Marcus Hale remained a few steps ahead, framed by the dim industrial lighting, his posture relaxed in a way that made everything around him feel staged. He wasn't holding a weapon. He didn't need to. The environment was his weapon. His eyes never left Cade. You're still standing, Marcus said, almost thoughtfully. That's rare. Cade didn't answer immediately. His weight shifted slightly, recalibrating balance, measuring distance, not just to Marcus, but to everything else in the room. Doors, vents, weak points, options. People tend to, Cade replied finally. When they're not the ones building cages. Marcus's lips curved, not quite a smile. Cages? He echoed. That's one way to see it. Behind Cade, Riven adjusted his stance, positioning himself slightly off-center. Not directly in front, not behind. Protective, ready, Marcus noticed. Interesting, he said quietly. You trust him more than your own instincts. Cade glanced down briefly at Riven. Yeah, he said. I do. That answer hung in the air longer than expected. Marcus studied it, not dismissing it, not mocking it, evaluating. You think that's strength, Marcus said, delegating survival to something driven by instinct. Cade's eyes sharpened slightly. You think ignoring instinct makes you smarter? Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, slow, measured. No, he said. I think surviving means understanding that instinct is just a primitive form of control. He gestured subtly around them. This, he continued, is refinement. Cade followed the motion with his eyes. The sealed corridors, the controlled airflow, the containment systems. Marcus wasn't wrong. This place was built with precision. But something about it felt incomplete. Like a system that had been perfected for the wrong purpose. A sudden movement. Behind Marcus, a man stepped forward hesitantly, older, thinner, his posture slightly hunched as if his body had forgotten how to stand fully upright. His face was narrow, pale from too much time away from sunlight, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth. His hair, once dark, had faded into uneven gray, thin in places, unkempt. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear alone, but from exhaustion. Elias Crow. Even before he spoke, Cade knew what he was. Not a soldier, not a guard, a builder, or rather, someone forced to keep building long after he should have stopped. "Marcus," Elias said, his voice low, strained. "The lower containment system." Marcus raised a hand. Elias stopped immediately. That told Cade everything. Not loyalty, control. Marcus didn't even look at him. "Not now," he said. Elias's jaw tightened. For a brief second, something flickered in his expression. Not defiance, regret. Then he lowered his gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. Cade watched him closely. The way he stood. The way he avoided eye contact. The way his hands hovered near the edge of his coat, as if he needed something to hold on to, but had learned not to reach for it. This wasn't a willing participant. This was a man who had stayed too long. Riven moved. Not toward Marcus, not toward the guards, toward Elias, slowly, carefully. The older man stiffened as the dog approached, his breath catching slightly. Not from fear, but from something deeper, something older. Recognition. Riven stopped just within arm's reach. Then, without warning, he sat, directly in front of Elias. Calm, still. Looking up at him, Elias's eyes widened slightly. His lips parted, but no words came out. Then, his hand moved. Slowly, uncertain, as if reaching towards something he had once known how to trust, but hadn't allowed himself to in years, and for the first time since Cade had seen him, Elias didn't look broken. He looked human, Marcus noticed. Of course he did. His gaze shifted briefly to the interaction, then back to Cade. "That," Marcus said quietly, "is exactly the problem." Cade didn't look away from Elias. "No," he said. "That's exactly the point." For a moment, no one moved. Then, everything changed. Elias's hand dropped. Not in surrender, in decision. "The system's unstable," he said suddenly, his voice sharper now, more focused. "You've been pushing it too hard. The containment cycles are overlapping." Marcus turned slowly. "You've said that before." "And I was right before," Elias snapped, something breaking through the weight that had been holding him down. "You can't keep forcing output without collapse." Marcus's expression didn't change, but the air did. "You're not here to advise me," Marcus said. "You're here to maintain function." Elias shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "I was here to fix something." He glanced briefly at Cade, then at Riven, then back at Marcus. "But this isn't fixing anything." Marcus stepped forward. "You don't get to decide that." Elias held his ground, for the first time. "No," he said, "but I do get to stop it." And then, he moved, fast. Not toward Cade, toward the control panel behind Marcus. Cade reacted instantly. "Riven!" But the dog had already shifted. Something changed in the floor. A faint hiss. A vent opened near Cade's left side. The air turned sharp. Chemical. Wrong. Riven slammed into Cade's leg, hard. Not attacking, redirecting, forcing him backward. A second later, the space where Cade had been standing filled with a thin, invisible cloud. Gas. Cade's breath caught. His eyes narrowed. "Good call," he muttered, already moving. Behind them, Elias reached the panel. His hands moved with sudden precision, fingers flying across controls he knew too well. Marcus turned. Too late. The system responded. Lights flickered. Doors shifted. A deep mechanical groan echoed through the structure. "What did you do?" Marcus demanded. Elias didn't look at him. "I opened it," he said. "Opened what?" Elias's voice dropped. "The part you didn't want anyone to see?" Marcus moved toward him. But Cade stepped in, fast. The two men collided, not in rage, but in force. Controlled, efficient. Marcus was trained. That much was clear immediately. Not as refined as Cade, but disciplined, deliberate, dangerous in his own way. They exchanged blows. Not wild, not sloppy. Each movement calculated, each impact measured. This wasn't a fight for dominance. It was a test of control. Marcus aimed for precision. Cade aimed for outcome. The difference showed. Within seconds, Cade gained the upper hand, redirecting Marcus's momentum, forcing him off balance, driving him back. But he didn't strike the final blow. He stopped. Marcus froze, breathing steady, eyes locked. "Go ahead," Marcus said quietly. Cade didn't move. "You think this ends anything?" Marcus continued. "You remove me, someone else replaces me. The system remains." Cade studied him, then stepped back. "No," he said. "But it stops you." Marcus's expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes shifted. Not defeat. Acknowledgement. The alarms shifted again, not louder. Different. More urgent. Cade turned. The corridors were opening. Not all, not enough, but some. "Time to move," he said. Riven was already heading toward the nearest exit path. Elias stood near the panel, breathing hard, his shoulders sagging slightly. "You need to go," Cade said. Elias nodded once. "I know." He looked around the space, then back at Cade. "I'm not coming." Cade didn't argue. Some people didn't leave, not because they couldn't, because they chose not to. Elias gave a small, tired smile. "Get them out," he said. Cade nodded, then turned. They moved fast, through corridors now partially open, partially sealed. Riven guided the way, avoiding unstable sections, leading Cade through paths that made sense before they became obvious. They reached the upper deck. Light. Real light. Sunlight poured through broken sections of the ship, flooding the space with warmth that felt almost unreal after the cold control below. Cade didn't stop. He moved through the opening, out into the open air. The forest stretched beyond, alive, uncontrolled, free. Behind him, sounds. Not all of them escaping, not all of them surviving. Cade didn't turn back immediately. He stepped forward. Then, carefully, he reached down and lifted one of the smaller animals that had followed them out. It trembled slightly in his arms. Alive. Barely, but alive. Cade looked out at the trees, then down at the creature, then back toward the ship. He exhaled slowly. "Not all of them," he said quietly. Riven stood beside him, silent, understanding, and for the first time since entering the ship, Cade allowed himself to feel it. Not victory, not relief. Something quieter, something heavier. He had saved some, but not enough. Morning did not return gently. It arrived with engines. The forest, which had once held its breath in quiet witness, now stirred under the distant growl of approaching vehicles. The sound rolled through the trees, low, mechanical, undeniable. Not the chaos of battle, not the panic of pursuit. authority. Cade stood at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the shadow of the ship's broken hull. The air outside felt different now, less controlled, less suffocating, but not lighter. Not yet. Behind him, the massive structure loomed in silence, its rusted body catching the pale morning sun. From a distance, it almost looked peaceful again, just another forgotten ruin swallowed by time. But Cade knew better. Beside him, Riven stood still, posture relaxed but alert, eyes moving between the ship and the approaching sound. "They're early," Cade murmured. Not surprised. Just done. Through the trees, the first vehicles emerged, dark, official, moving with purpose. Not rushed, not careless. A convoy of utility trucks and marked units pushed through the outer edge of the forest, tires cutting into sand and soft earth. Men and women stepped out quickly, efficiently, organized, prepared. One of them moved ahead of the others. She was in her mid-30s, tall, around 5'8", with a lean, athletic build that came from field work rather than training rooms. Her hair was pulled back into a tight, practical knot, dark brown with strands that caught the light. Her face was sharp, but not harsh. Defined cheekbones, steady eyes, skin lightly weathered by sun and long hours outdoors. Her gaze landed on Cade immediately. Not hostile, not trusting, assessing. Mara Whitlock, a forest ranger, but not the kind that only watched trees. Her presence carried the weight of someone who had seen what people could do to the wild, and had chosen to stand in the way of it anyway. She approached without hesitation, boots firm against the uneven ground. "You were inside," she said, not as a question. Cade didn't answer right away. He shifted the small animal in his arms slightly, careful, controlled. "Yes." Her eyes flicked to the creature, then back to him. "How many?" Cade's jaw tightened. "Not enough." Mara held his gaze for a second longer, then nodded. No judgment, just understanding. Behind her, teams were already moving toward the ship, coordinated, equipped with containment gear, medical units, and scanning devices. They didn't rush in blindly. They approached like people who had been trained to respect danger, even when it wore silence. One of the medics reached Cade. A young man, maybe late 20s, pale under his gear but focused, hands steady despite the situation. He took the animal gently, examining it with quick, practiced movements. "It'll live," he said quietly. Cade nodded once. That was enough. He didn't stay to explain everything, didn't walk them through the corridors, didn't point out the hidden systems or the sections still unstable. He didn't need to. People like Mara would find it. People like her always did. Cade stepped back, giving them space. Riven stayed with him, watching, waiting, as if he already knew what came next. It happened quietly, not in the chaos of movement or the noise of machines, but in a small moment, almost missed. One of the responders emerged from the ship, carrying something wrapped in a thin, gray blanket, not equipment, not debris. Carefully, too carefully. Cade's attention shifted instantly. The man approached the medic team, lowering the bundle gently to the ground. The blanket moved. Just slightly. A shape beneath it. Familiar. Too familiar. Riven stepped forward before Cade did. Slow, measured. The dog's ears lowered, not in fear, not in submission, in something deeper, recognition again. But this time, there was no response from the other side. Cade moved closer, each step heavier than the last. The medic knelt, pulling the blanket back just enough. The old dog? the one from the container. Its body lay still now, chest no longer rising, eyes closed as if it had simply decided to rest. For a moment, no one spoke. No one moved. Cade felt the world narrow. Not collapse. Just focus. All the noise faded. All the movement slowed. There was only that shape on the ground, and the space it had left behind. He didn't make it, the medic said quietly. Cade nodded once. No reaction, no outward shift. But something inside him, settled, not healed, not resolved, but placed where it belonged. Riven stepped closer, lowering his head slightly, his nose hovering just above the still form. He didn't touch, didn't need to. Then he stepped back, as if understanding that some things were no longer meant to be disturbed. Cade crouched slowly. His movements were deliberate, controlled, respectful. He reached down and touched the collar. The metal tag was cold, worn, but still there, still carrying whatever name had once meant everything. Cade didn't read it. He didn't need to. He knew what it meant. "I said I wouldn't leave you," he murmured. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. The burial was simple. No ceremony, no witnesses. Cade carried the body himself, away from the clearing, back toward the edge of the forest, where the ground was softer, shaded by tall pines. The earth gave way under his hands, not easily, but enough. Riven stayed close, not assisting, not interfering, just present. When the hole was deep enough, Cade lowered the dog into it, adjusting its position carefully, ensuring it lay with dignity, not haste. He covered it slowly, each motion steady, final. When it was done, he sat back on his heels for a moment, then reached into the collar again, removed the tag. He stood, scanning the nearby trees, then stepped toward one, a tall pine with rough bark and strong limbs. He tied the tag to a low branch, no marker, no name carved into stone, just metal and memory. By the time he returned to the clearing, the operation was fully underway. Containment teams moved in and out of the ship. Equipment was being transported. Voices filled the space where silence had once ruled. It looked like progress. It looked like resolution. But Cade knew better. Some things didn't end. They just changed hands. Mara found him again near the edge of the tree line. "You're leaving," she said. Not a question. Cade nodded. "You could stay," she added. "Give a statement. Help us understand what we're dealing with." Cade glanced back once at the ship, then shook his head. "You'll figure it out." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," she said. "We will." There was something like respect in her tone, not admiration, recognition, of someone who had done what needed to be done and knew when to walk away. The forest swallowed them quickly, just like it always did. Cade and Riven moved along a narrow path that barely existed, the sounds of the operation fading behind them with each step. The trees closed in, branches weaving overhead, light breaking into scattered patterns across the ground. For a while, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was full. Of everything that had happened, of everything that hadn't. After some time, Cade stopped, just for a moment. He turned back. The ship was barely visible now through the trees, a broken silhouette against the pale sky. Still massive, still wrong, but no longer hidden. Cade exhaled slowly. "We weren't meant to find it," he said quietly. A pause. Then, "But we were meant to stop it." He turned forward again. Riven didn't look back. He never had. The dog's eyes were fixed ahead, focused on something beyond the visible path, something only he could fully understand. Cade followed, not because he had nowhere else to go, but because, for the first time in a long time, he wasn't lost. The forest opened slightly ahead, light spilling through in soft, uncertain patterns. Not clear, not easy, but real. And that was enough. In the quiet moments after the story ends, there is something deeper than survival that lingers. A man did not go into that forest to change the world. A dog did not speak, did not explain, did not ask for permission. And yet, together, they found something hidden, something forgotten, and they chose not to walk away. Maybe that is where miracles begin, not in grand signs or voices from the sky, but in small, faithful steps. In the instinct to stop, in the courage to turn back, in the decision to care when it would be easier not to. Sometimes, God does not move mountains in front of us. Sometimes, He sends a quiet guide, a moment, a feeling, and waits to see if we will listen. That day, a man followed a dog, and because he did, lives were saved. A wrong was faced. And something broken, even if only a little, was made right. In your own life, you may not find a ship in the forest, but you will find moments, quiet ones, where something inside you says, stop, look closer, don't walk away. That may not be coincidence. That may be grace. If this story touched you in any way, share it with someone who might need to be reminded that doing the right thing still matters. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part of the story stayed with you the most. And if you believe in stories about loyalty, courage, and second chances, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey. May God watch over you, guide your steps, and protect you and your loved ones wherever you are. And may you never ignore the quiet voice that leads you toward what is right.